Welcome to the program. We have a really practical, very important program today, and I'm thrilled to have uh, as co-speakers Amanda Coplin, and I'm going to let Amanda tell you a little about herself so you'll know her background for this particular program as we get started when I introduce her, and Jonathan Blotmacher, who I'm sure you all know. Very important topic that just does not receive enough attention at all. And we have a wonderful charity that works in this space too, that is going to tell you a little bit about their mission and the great work they do. So we're going to talk today about addictions and planning for impaired clients. And we're going to even define addictions because it's much broader than many of you might realize. And we're going to try to focus on a lot of practical applications far more than technical ones. A couple quick comments before we get started. The PowerPoint is on the web console. If you click on handouts, you'll expand that component of the console. You can download it. We have posted the PowerPoint to schenkmanlaw.com on the blog post on the front page. You can get it there. Peak and Interactive Legal, our two sponsors, will have it on their websites. We will record the program is being recorded, and within a few days of the program airing, we will have the recording and all materials posted on the Schenkman Law website. The address is there, as well as on the Peak Trust Company and the Interactive Legal website, so you can access it everywhere. We don't give formal CLE or CPE, but we will issue a certificate of attendance. The certificates come direct from the system to the email address used to register. We can't modify or change the certificates. If you have questions, my suggestion is you email Amanda, Jonathan, or I, and we will do our best to help you out. It's better to email us than to post it in the web console. So Vanessa, I will let you introduce yourself in Interactive.
Great. Thank you, Marty. Welcome, everybody. My name is Vanessa Knega. I'm the CEO of Interactive Legal. We are proud to count Marty as one of our advisors and to sponsor this webinar and many of the other webinars presented by Marty and Jonathan, of course. I applaud our panelists for tackling what can be a difficult topic, but one that's important to many families and affects estate planning. You can find the recording of this webinar and many of the previous webinars that have been sponsored by Peak and Interactive Legal and Schenkman Law on our Interactive Legal website. And if you'd like more information on Interactive Legal and our automated automated document programs for estate planning and elder law attorneys, please visit our website at interactivelegal.com or email the email address on your screen.
I use Interactive in my drafting, and we are going to show at the end of our slide deck. We may not get to it, but Interactive has let me reproduce a provision that they have about a drug addiction and alcohol addiction in the materials. So you'll find their actual language with some comments and thoughts on it in case you want to modify it at the end of the slide deck. So thank you to Interactive and Vanessa for letting us share their actual language. Nicole.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Nicole King. I'm one of the trust officers here at Peak Trust, and we are pleased and honored to be able to sponsor today's webinar. A little bit about Peak Trust Company. We offer a full spectrum of trustee services serving individuals, families, and their trusted advisors. We offer flexible and customized administrative services for all types of trusts. If you should have any questions, please feel free to reach out or visit our website at www.peaktrust.com. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Marty.
Thank you. In the context of our topic today concerning addiction, even if you customarily use individual and family trustees, when you have clients with some of the challenges we're going to talk about, it's really important to think of the benefits of using an independent institutional trustee. I've seen too many times where family members serving as trustees are simply hounded and harassed to the point where they just cave in and do whatever a particular client that's got an issue or challenge might request, which is ultimately not helpful for anybody. So really, I guess a comment or a plug for the industry as a whole, not just for Peak. We're very fortunate. Yeah,
Marty, let me also add that if you appoint an individual, that individual may currently or in the future become subject to some sort of addiction. So you need to not only consider what do you do with a beneficiary who's an addict or has some abuse problem, you also need to think about it for fiduciaries as well. And as Vanessa was indicating, Interactive Legal has special provisions for that. But I think that what you want to do is to have at least one institutional fiduciary, but to have a provision to remove that fiduciary if it turns out that it's not really doing the best job for the family.
great points, and we'll get into some of that. So we're very fortunate to have a charity that is very specifically in the space we're talking about. And Destiny, can you tell everybody about the wonderful work that Thistle Farms does?
Sure. So my name is Destiny Whitmore. I'm the corporate relations manager at Thistle Farms, and we are a nonprofit that's a social justice enterprise, and we work with women who have been victims of sex trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. And what we found is that usually, if women have been a part of sex trafficking and prostitution, addiction kind of comes along with that. And our goal is to heal, restore, and employ. And so we provide 2-year residential housing for free of cost to the women in the program. And we currently have 28 spaces in that program, and we're full right now. We have a wait list, and we have a national network where we work with other sister organizations to get women who've been displaced or in different situations where they need to be. And so we employ them. And so we have a social justice enterprise where we create body and home products made from all natural oils. And we always say that as the women are healing, we want our products to be just as healing as those are. And so if you would like to, visit our website, purchase products, or donate, you can visit thistlefarms.org. We're in Nashville. We welcome visitors all the time, and our doors are open again. So we're excited to do the work we do and just be a part of a solution for women. So thank you for having us.
Thank you, Destiny. If you need to contact Thistle Farms, if you have a client or if you yourself would like to donate, and we certainly encourage all of you to do so, it's very easy to find them. Just Google search Thistle Farms, it comes right up, and it's a wonderful cause, and I encourage all of you to give some thought to doing it. So please give some thought to do that. Now, we're going to jump into the program, and I think before we start, I'm going to ask Amanda to introduce herself and then talk about slide 10, because this is something that too many of us don't realize how common it is. And I think that's a great way to start our presentation, because this does affect your clients. It affects my clients. And after Amanda gives us some general statistics, Jonathan has a couple of client stories that he's going to relate without obviously any names or identifying information that I think will really drive it home. So let's start in that way. Amanda, tell everybody what you do, because I think that's very important for them to understand, and then maybe talk about some of the stats on the top of page 10.
Sure. My name is Amanda Copeland. I'm the CEO of Copeland Consulting. It's a national concierge behavioral health company. We work with several individuals that have mental and behavioral health disorders, addictions, eating disorders, and everything in between. We also work with trusted advisors and families in order to help everybody heal and get on track together. So what I'll say is that addiction is not a poor person's problem. That is a common misperception, and it affects everybody across the board. Drug use is on the rise, and in fact, it's approximately 1 in every 10 Americans over the age of 12. This is not just adults, this is young people too, and they need help and support to be able to make sure that they can recover and that it's identified, and that the money that they have access to doesn't accidentally end up killing them. So you shouldn't assume that these are other people's problems or that this doesn't affect your family, because it does genuinely impact everybody. So for us, what we want to do is provide education on the background of addiction. We want to be able to help you identify where these problems exist with your clients and potentially your families. And we want to be able to give you resources to assist your clients. And we are very, very well aware that you are attorneys, financial advisors, trustees, and other trusted advisors. You're not counselors, and you shouldn't be. So we're going to help you learn to stay in your lane, but also be a resource for the clients you serve.
So I think it's also important to note that when we talk of addiction, it's not merely drug and alcohol addiction, which 1 in 10 Americans over age 12, as Amanda said, are facing. But we also have a wide range of other addictions, from shopping addictions to gambling addictions to sex addictions, and there's probably many others. So any type of addictive behavior is really the broad subject we're going to talk about. So merely because we're focusing many of our comments on drugs and alcohol, don't assume that these comments don't apply to a much wider range of addictions. Before we really get into the slides in the program, I wanted to have Amanda just really emphasize with that statistic how critically significant this is, because it clearly affects a large number of our clients. And my impression is that when we are dealing with very successful, wealthy clients, which many of us do, that these things in many people's minds, they don't happen to us, they happen to somebody else. So we may face clients that are far more uncomfortable admitting to the issues they or family members or other loved ones have. And it makes it even harder for us to assist in the ways that we're going to talk about. Before we go on, Jonathan, I know you had some examples and personal comments you wanted to make to really drive home how significant this is. So why don't you give those thoughts?
Yeah, I grew up in an upper middle class family in Garden City on Long Island, and you might think it was great. My father was one of the leading tax lawyers in the United States, but he was also a practicing alcoholic, and it was horrible for our family. And my mother let him get away with it because she felt we would be impoverished if she left him, but it basically ruined his life. He died very early. And it wasn't just my father, it was his brother who died at 43 and who was also a lawyer, another brother who was a brilliant dentist, #1 in his college class, #1 in his dental school class, who were also alcoholics, and their father was an alcoholic. It really was bad. And I've also had a number of other relatives have it as well. But it's not just in my family that there's been problems. I've seen it with clients. I had 2 extremely wealthy clients, billionaires, whose sons were addicted to gambling. One was actually killed by members of the mob because his father stopped paying for his gambling debts, which ran up to the millions of dollars. And his father made a decision that he would just cut him off and that would stop his gambling, but it didn't, and he was eventually literally killed. Another one had a son who was addicted to gambling, and it upset him so much he got into cocaine and he died of an overdose from that. I also want to tell you one story. As many of you may know, I'm the guy who came up with the concept of decanting trusts. And I had the trustee of a trust tell me that he was going to have to pay out literally millions of dollars to the beneficiary when she turned 21. And she was completely addicted to cocaine and heroin. And so what I did is I had him decant the trust so it was going to stay in trust for her for life. When she got 21 and expected to receive the money, she found out she wasn't going to get it, that it had been put in further trust, and she hired a team of lawyers. Fortunately, the judge ruled that the extension of the term of the trust for her life was proper and she would not get the money. 10 years later, that young woman wrote me a letter saying, Jonathan, I can't thank you enough. If I had gotten that money, I would be dead now. It all would have gone up in my nose. So don't think, and this is one of America's wealthiest families. All 3 of the stories I've told you are very wealthy families. In fact, maybe Amanda will address the fact that in some ways, it's more risky to have an addict in a wealthy family than in an impoverished family. Marty, back to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for sharing that. I don't think there could be a better way to drive home how real and pervasive these issues are. And I think, in a broader context, we as advisors, we pride ourselves on creating financial plans and estate plans and drafting creative documents and minimizing taxes. But in the end, if we don't address these absolutely critical personal issues, and addiction is just but one of them, we're not really protecting or serving our clients. And these issues are hard for many of us to talk about. In my MBA program, I didn't learn anything about any of these issues. In my law school program, I didn't learn anything about these issues. You know, we learn how to be technicians, but this human element is just so vital to rounding out and making relevant and meaningful and holistic what we do. So some of the things that we're going to talk about, let me just start with the middle point, which I think we've emphasized, but it's really so critical. Your clients are affected. This affects your clients. Addiction issues are real and they affect all of our clients. We need to learn how to ask questions of clients to identify whether addiction issues exist, either for them or members of their family. And Amanda's going to give you a lot of really practical information on that. And again, we're not trying to make any of us into social workers or mental health professionals or physicians. We're going to stay in our swim lane, but we need to know what we do in our swim lane to help identify these issues. And Amanda's going to go through that in a little while in our program. We need to learn how to identify the signs of addiction in clients, and not just clients, the fiduciaries, beneficiaries, others, right? We need to understand the resources that are available to assist addressing the problem. And Amanda is going to do a very clever 911 sort of an analogy to help you understand what you do and don't do as a lawyer, accountant, trust officer, insurance consultant when you become aware of these issues. We're going to try to talk about, from a legal and planning perspective, some of the steps that you can take to try to prevent harm. And the bottom line to that, in really one word, is everything should be in trust. Jonathan, you want to make a comment on that as to why, in particular for addiction issues, having everything in trust rather than outright is so critical?
Well, there are so many reasons to have a trust. You know, it prevents the foolish dissipation of wealth, which that young woman I mentioned would have done. It all would have gone up her nose, for example. It also provides protection from claims of creditors. And, you know, that's something that can arise whether the beneficiary has an addiction or not, but it's probably enhanced, it's aggravated if the beneficiary does. Also, a trust provides the greatest opportunity to save taxes, both income taxes as well as wealth transfer taxes like estate and gift taxes. But number one you want to do is to benefit the beneficiary. And the best way you can do that is having everything go in trust. Now, if it should come out of trust, it's easy for the trustee to do that if that makes sense, but almost always the benefit you can get from property that's in trust can be provided by the trust. For example, if the beneficiary needs a home, the trustee can buy a home and allow the beneficiary to live there without charge or with minimal charges. And the tax law tells us that the rent-free use of property by a beneficiary of something owned by a trust, whether it's a home, whether it's an item of tangible personal property like a painting or whatever, does not result in imputed income. And you might think, well, why did they let them get away with that? Well, think about a life estate. If when I die, I give a life estate to my son, and when he dies, it's going to go to, say, his descendants, the use of that property is not going to result in income to him or to the life estate. The life estate is just his relationship to the property. It's not a separate entity like a trust is. So, you know, the most important thing I do for my clients, and I'm absolutely insistent, is put it all in trust.
So I've seen a number, I want to just elaborate for a second on a comment Jonathan made. I've seen a number of situations where well-to-do clients have helped their children buy homes. And when there were addiction issues, gambling issues, drug issues, all that would happen is the bills on the home would not get paid, property tax and utility bills would accumulate. Any time they could get a mortgage out or a lien on the home to get any money out of it, even at absurd terms, they did so. So having the house in a trust rather than outright is critical. Let me take a second and make a comment to, for example, financial advisors that are listening to the call. So frequently when an attorney creates an estate plan, and every attorney on the call I'm sure has this happen, we all recommend to clients to come back on a regular basis. You know, some may say every 3 years, some may every 5 years, some when there's a change. We all say when there's a change. I say every year you should come back, but too many clients just don't listen. And it's not uncommon to get an email or a call from a client who hasn't been in 25 years about an issue. But those same clients that may not come back for 5, 10, 20 years to the attorney are probably speaking to their financial advisor. So if you're functioning as a financial advisor, get a copy of those trusts. If you're functioning as an accountant and you're doing a trust income tax return, get a copy of the trust for the permanent file. And you don't have to be a lawyer. Any financial advisor or accountant can eyeball a trust and see if the trust pays out its assets at age 25 or a third at 25, 30, and 35 or something like that. Tell the client, go back to your attorney. You can even caveat and say, I'm not sure, but it appears that this trust pays out to your child, your heir, your nephew, your cousin, whoever the beneficiary is at a fairly young age. That's not what you want. And in many cases, all that really needs to be done is the concept that Jonathan talked about earlier, which lawyers are very familiar with at this point, but maybe financial advisors and accountants not quite as familiar, is the trust is decanted into another trust that is identical perhaps, but for it does not end until required to end under state law, and thereby you can have a trustee control and protect to a degree what the beneficiary gets. And whatever concerns the family has about having the beneficiary involved, not involved, those can all be addressed in some fashion. But the protection the trust will afford, as Jonathan explained, is absolutely critical. And you know, the reality is we may not be able to identify today which heir may develop an addiction issue a year, 5 years, a decade from now. So the default and simple plan is have everything in trust as long as possible. If the child is doing well, the heir doesn't have to be a child is doing well, then you know certainly the trustee can be as generous as possible. But holding a house or a major asset in the trust, dispensing money from the trust and leaving money that's not needed inside the trust will protect that money and protect the heir if an addiction issue should arise in the future. Jonathan or Amanda, any comments before we go on?
I have a quick comment. So I myself had an estate attorney draw up documents, and my older sister is in recovery, thank God, from alcohol addiction and gambling addiction. And so one of the things she asked me is there anybody in your family who's not prepared to handle anything they might inherit? And we talked about my sister being in recovery. And so there are provisions in there before she gets to make any decisions about, you know, getting tested and making sure that she's sober and all of that kind of stuff. But had the estate attorney not asked me those questions, I would have walked away because I would have understood that she's not prepared to help my family in the way that we need. And she also understood the impact on my sister had my sister not been sober and she was making life-altering decisions for myself and for our family, what that guilt would have been like for her to carry the rest of her life. And so this is not about protecting money. This is about protecting lives and legacies. And I think that's the important thing to remember. Your clients want you to ask.
And I will tell you, ILS that Vanessa Kanega introduced, we have some great language in there to take care of addictions and to say to beneficiaries, if you want to get any benefit from this trust, whether it's money outright, whether it's a home, no matter what it is, you have to undergo some sort of medical testing if the trustee determines that that's appropriate. Now, the person who will resist that, of course, is the one who is addicted. So this is kind of a self-proving matter. You go to say there's a trust for Marty and I'm the trustee, and I say, Marty, I'd like you to undergo a blood test. And Marty absolutely screams, this is invading my privacy. I absolutely will not do it. Well, guess what, Marty? Then you're not going to get anything. These are extremely important tools that you have to place into a trust or a will to try to help the family. As Amanda just said, this is to protect and help the individuals. It's not just to protect the money. That's really secondary.
So let's talk about the role of the attorney in planning for addiction. And we've made a number of these comments already. I'm going to go through slide 11, but Jonathan and Amanda, interrupt me as many times as you want if you have thoughts or comments. The first point is actually one that Jonathan made. When you start to get involved with clients in discussions of some of these issues like addiction or matters like addiction, addictive behavior, they're going to be sensitive and uncomfortable for many clients. So certainly one of the things we should do is reassure the clients that we will keep any information they give us confidential. And I think that's important to do, and it's really fundamental to the attorney's relationship. And every advisor, whatever discipline, should reassure clients that anything they speak to them about is confidential and is going to remain with that advisor, and that we're asking these questions not to be nosy, but because we're trying to help them. Just like Amanda, and thank you for sharing that personal story, Amanda. Just like Amanda said that the attorney that her family went to asked the question. We need to ask the questions. Now, the traditional role of the attorney was one of family counselor. And over the decades, that really sort of evolved into becoming an estate tax minimization advisor. If some of the current proposals in Washington go through, it may evolve into becoming an income tax minimization advisor and perhaps a trust and estate tax minimization advisor. But that being said, the traditional role of the attorney was family counselor, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. That role, not just minimizing taxes, but being a true family advisor, is in fact the role that will create the most benefit to the clients, the most rewards for us as advisors, and really develop the depth of a long-lasting relationship. But to be the family advisor, the family counselor, we really have to dig into all facets of what's going on with the client's family or loved ones, however they define it. Addiction is merely one of the many personal or human issues that needs to be talked about. We really can't properly or well do our job of planning for trust, powers of attorney, fiduciary appointments, and all these things without addressing these issues. And it's important that we are proactive and not reactive. Our organizers, our questionnaires should solicit this information. And it's important when we have intake interviews with clients for all the advisors, financial advisor, attorney, accountants, everybody, to try to inquire about some of this information. We need to be proactive to initiate these conversations because clients may be uncomfortable or unwilling to talk about it, but if we bring it up, they will do it. I remember a couple of years ago, I was working with another advisor, doesn't matter what discipline, but she wanted to lay out an agenda for a meeting, an initial estate planning meeting with a client that we were working together on. And I was rather resistant because I said, I really don't like to have an agenda in front of a client when I have an initial meeting. I want to talk to the client. I want to have the client go off on whatever tangents they want, because it's those tangents that often drop the clues as to what some of the real important issues are, whether it's an addiction issue, a spending issue, a family health issue. There's all sorts of issues that everybody has. But if we get too rigid in terms of the topics that we're going to cover, we never get to that. I like to just sort of listen to the client, listen between the lines and hear what they have to say. So to me, that's really kind of the role. And I'm sorry I put attorney on the slide, because whether you're a financial advisor or any other advisor, accountant, trust officer, all these comments I think really do apply. Jonathan or Amanda, any comments or thoughts on that before we go to the next slide?
Nope.
So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and talk about, and I know that not everyone on the call is an attorney, but I just think it's helpful to have this discussion, not only for attorneys, but I think these are good points for everyone to give some thought to. So ABA Model Rule 1.14 talks about dealing with a client with diminished capacity, and certainly if a client has an addiction issue, it's possible that there's an issue of diminished capacity. So when a client's capacity to make adequately considered decisions in connection with representation is diminished, and certainly impairment by drug or alcohol use as an example could do that, the lawyer shall, as far as reasonably possible, maintain a normal client-lawyer relationship with the client. And we're going to talk about each of these in a minute. I'm just kind of setting the table now. When the lawyer reasonably believes that a client has diminished capacity, drug or alcohol use could do that, is at risk for substantial physical, financial, or other harm. Jonathan's example couldn't better illustrate what an addiction could lead to, gambling addiction or a drug addiction, and what could be more severe than the death of a client's child in those examples. If the client cannot adequately act in the client's own interest, the lawyer may take reasonably necessary protective action, including consulting with individuals or entities that have the ability to take action to protect the client, and so on. C, information relating to the representation of a client with diminished capacity is protected by Rule 1.6, and so on. Let's take and kind of comment a little further, and again, Jonathan and Amanda, feel free to jump in on what 1.14 means in the context of a client or client's child or fiduciary with an addiction issue that could affect them. So when we talk about ability to make decisions, when a client's capacity to make adequately considered decisions in connection with the representation is diminished because of drug abuse, the lawyer should maintain as normal of a client-lawyer relationship as possible. So you still need to have that involvement with the client. You still need to try to represent the client, but it's going to be difficult. And I think that again, and we're going to get to it in a few minutes, the 991, no, I didn't say that right, the 911 analogy that Amanda's going to talk about will be very helpful, and accessing resources, which we're going to talk about soon, will be very helpful. Client counsel may take action if the model rule criteria is met, but what is financial harm? And this is a real interesting issue, and I apologize, I forgot if it was Jonathan or Amanda that mentioned, probably Jonathan, but how does great wealth change the analysis? So if a client is worth, $500,000 and is spending $10,000 a month on a shopping or gambling addiction, that's going to have a pretty significant impact fairly quickly on their wealth. If a client's worth, and Jonathan, I think, said $1 billion or billions of dollars in the examples he had, if the client has a gambling addiction and spends $100,000 a month, 10 times the prior example, it may have no financial impact of substance. It's certainly not going to endanger the solvency, the ability to pay for food or live in a home. So how do you determine what financial harm is? It may be very relative to the level of wealth. Now, in Jonathan's example, the financial harm led to physical harm, but you really need to kind of think this through. So there's an interesting article on shoplifting by rich and famous people, and I've had a couple of clients over the years, very, very wealthy, could afford to buy the chain of stores that they went into, but nevertheless would go in and shoplift. And it was a very difficult issue to deal with, and it was hard to sort of fathom, what it was. The excitement, it wasn't that they needed the product and couldn't afford to buy it. They could have bought the store, the chain of stores, but nonetheless they went and committed theft in order to fulfill this addiction. So not quite the typical shopping addiction, but
indeed, Marty, recently there's been some stuff in the paper about, very wealthy young movie starlet who's having a fight with her family. It's typically all about the money, but she's, been arrested and others have been arrested. And can you imagine having someone in your family arrested and then having a criminal record, if not going to jail? And although for simple shoplifting, it's unlikely you're going to go to jail, if you do it repeatedly, you probably will wind up in jail. And keep in mind that people who go to jail have a very, very diminished life expectancy. In fact, I had a client who was trying to get insurance on the life of his son. And the insurance company called me and said, Jonathan, we're not going to insure the life of that young man because he has been arrested 4 times for hitting his wife. We know he's going to wind up in jail, and people who go to jail die early. So this is something that, it may seem pretty harmless. She's just stolen, $1,000 or $100 worth of stuff, or he has, or whatever it is. And maybe it's for the thrill, maybe it's for another reason, but it can lead to very, very bad things happening to them, including if you have a criminal record, that may be permanently on your record. And again, I have a relative who was arrested when he was 21 in college for peddling marijuana. and he has been unable for 25 years to get any job. He's got a master's degree in business administration. The interviews go great, but then they do the Google search and they find this on his record. And, you know, their attitude is, why should we take the risk? This guy has basically admitted to being a felon. If we allow him into our organization and he does something, we will be blamed. We didn't protect the company or our clients or whatever. So it's very, very important to get on this as early as possible and understand that it is a very serious matter for the individual and for his or her family.
So the comments that are highlighted in yellow, if there's a client at substantial risk of physical, financial, or other harm, the lawyer may, not require, but may take necessary protective actions, and we're going to talk about that. But the reason I highlighted this is the point, and I know we talked about it, but it's just so significant. For wealthy clients, what is substantial financial harm? And I don't think looking the other way or ignoring the issue is something that's going to solve the problem. But also understand that the client that may have a shopping addiction, for example, may really view that as something that gives them pleasure and their wealth entitles them to do it. It may not make it unharmful, but it may not cause substantial financial harm. So you get into a lot of very gray, uncertain areas and try to even interpret what this is. And obviously we need to act cautiously. In determining what information can or cannot be disclosed, just as a reminder on the bottom, you know, that information may still be protected. Let's take a quick look on page 14, ABA Model Rule 1.7, conflicts of interest. So, for example, you know, one client may be concerned about the addictive behavior of another client, you know, the other spouse, for example. Do we have a conflict? You know, the representation of one client will be directly adverse to the other if one spouse is concerned about the gambling addiction of the other, and the other feels this is their entertainment and that they can afford to do it, and their wealth that they've amassed entitles them to do it. So again, we can start to find ourselves, and again, even if you're not an attorney in other disciplines, where one spouse enjoys the addictive behavior and feels they're entitled to do it, and it may not have financially, you know, material or substantial harm, as on the prior slide, but it's still deeply disturbing to the other client. So just keep all of this in mind, that you know, it makes representation potentially very difficult. If a wealthy client has a gambling or addiction issue, might the client view interference with those activities as their interference with their enjoyable right? Are they viewing that as adverse? So again, for example, spouse one is very concerned about spouse two's gambling issue. Now, do we have a situation where the representation of them as a couple becomes problematic because they're adverse from one to the other? And it may make it impossible to handle the representation. If counsel believes there may be a concurrent conflict because of the addiction and seeks to continue the representation, might the lawyer be embroiled in a claim by the addictive client against the client seeking to help address those challenges? And you may. So obviously you want to be cautious for yourself. Again, just some cautions. It is not an easy area to tread into. Let's go on to the next slide. Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you do the 911. And folks, this analogy may sound simple, but I think it's really powerful. Amanda?
You're right, Marty. This analogy is really simple. What I hear over and over again from trusted advisors is, I don't know what to do. I don't want to ask the question if I don't have resources or an answer, and then they avoid the whole thing altogether. But what I'll tell you is that you weren't born understanding and learning how to call 911. And so it's just a simple process of learning the steps you can take in the role you play and literally helping to save somebody's life. So with calling 911, you identify there's a problem. If somebody is grabbing their chest on the street, you don't diagnose whether it's a heart attack or heartburn. You identify there might be a problem. So the next step is you ask relevant questions. You go up to that person, you say, are you okay? Do you need help? And you don't try to fix it yourself. You know the relevant resources available to help. So this isn't Grey's Anatomy. You don't just start cracking someone's chest open on the street. You also don't call Domino's. You don't call a museum. You call 911 because that's the relevant and appropriate resource to help that person in the moment. You don't ignore it and just walk away. The next thing you do is you take action. You make the call to 911. You follow their instructions until they get there, but you don't walk away before appropriate resources are in place. The next thing you do and the final thing you do is just follow up. You say to 911 when the ambulance comes, is there anything else you need from me? But what you don't do is play the hero. So it's the same process with clients who are struggling with addictive behaviors. You identify there's a problem, so you understand and learn the signs. You ask them relevant questions. You could do this in your intake, and you can do this throughout your time with them. You know the relevant resources to help. You take the action and you follow up. It's literally that simple. You do not have to be the hero, and you do not have to have all the answers. You just need to know someone who does.
And we're going to help you, Amanda's going to help you understand how to find some of those people. Amanda, you want to continue?
Yeah, so with wealthy clients, we know that this is a problem because these researchers have done a lot of research on children of the affluent. So they, in their research, have found that the affluent individuals are reluctant to seek help because concerns about privacy, reputation, and embarrassment. And these factors actually make it harder for them to access help than people that are middle class or lower class, where it is more acceptable to have problems. So affluent parents often feel like they have to maintain a veneer of well-being, that, you know, problems should be something that they're managed, and you know, that people who can't manage their problems are less well off. So there's also this misconception of, oh, poor rich kid, or oh, poor rich people, what kind of problems do you have? And this stigma and this shame prevents them from getting and accessing the help they need and having other people confront them lovingly in the same way other people would be confronted. So, you know, I think just being aware of this will help you be able to step up and say, okay, and normalize it and say, I know you have problems too. This isn't just a poor people problem. This is a problem that everybody has, and be able to actually give them the help that they deserve.
So let me make a couple of comments about that. Very, very good and important points. I believe every trust I draft has the provision that you'll see at the end of the slide deck on drug and alcohol abuse. One of the reasons I leave it in, just like I include in pretty much almost every trust some type of special needs, supplemental needs provision, is because no one knows today what might happen 5 years in the future. So the fact that, let's say, these problems may not exist today doesn't mean they may not exist in the future. And if the clear tendency, although we may see how that might change a little bit with some of the pending tax legislation, the clear tendency or objective is to draft very long-term trust, because those are the most protective, not only from a tax perspective under current law, but from a human perspective, as we've been talking about. So if I include a provision to deal with drug and alcohol testing and abuse, and Jonathan talked about it a few minutes ago, and if we have time at the end, we'll actually go through the interactive legal provision that we've provided and talk in more detail, but if not, it's in the materials for you. By including that, when we review the trust document, if that issue had been sidestepped somehow or swept under the carpet or not addressed earlier, it's going to come up. So including these provisions in a trust instrument, I think, is a great way to make sure that if during the intake interview, the meetings with the client, these issues have not been talked about because the client was uncomfortable or somehow they got overlooked, the trust review will itself bring it up. Another point, one of the ways that we can all bring these issues up, along with a whole range of other human issues, in the questionnaire or intake sheet that we have. Do you have any religious issues that may affect planning? Do you have any health issues that may affect planning? Are there any lifestyle decisions, lifestyles that may affect planning that we need to address in the documents? Do you have any addiction? You or any of your potential heirs have any addiction issues that may need to be addressed? If you put it in the questionnaire, that normalizes it, because you're not using a questionnaire for each client that's drafted for them. The client knows it's a standard form. So the mere inclusion of all these questions with a whole bunch of other personal or human type questions normalizes it, that these are things lots of people face, and that's why we're asking about them. And including them in the documents does that as well. So Amanda, how do we know addiction's a problem?
Well, so continuing from the previous slide, the parents in general tend to be aware when their children are depressed, but they tend to not seek professional help unless symptoms are actually inconveniences or disruptions. Again, it's that veneer of well-being. And so until it disrupts us, we're just going to keep trying to cover it up and, make sure it looks like everything's all good. But professionals around the high-income parents are actually more resistant and scared because wealthy people tend to threaten lawsuits. And so people would rather just not touch the issue and try to also help maintain that veneer of well-being. And so actually, the wealthy families and the wealthy kids are actually becoming the next high-risk population. So that's a really important and critical thing to realize. And then, with the affluent populations, achievement pressures and isolation from adults contribute to these issues.
Jonathan, any thoughts or comments on how, for example, estate planners may react to concerns, if the client's uncomfortable, well, let's just move on and not address it?
Well, Marty, that of course is a very difficult thing, but if you feel you can't adequately represent the client because the client is withholding important information, I think you have to consider resigning. And, the most important thing is to get the client to do something. And it may be the client that has the addiction. Again, we talked about, 1 in 12, maybe an alcoholic or a drug addict, but actually I think the statistics are worse. If you go back to, I think it's slide 10, let's not do it, it points to a Washington Post article where it said 1 in 8 adult Americans is an alcoholic. And again, I've experienced in so many places. And again, the client is going to be more vulnerable if he or she is addicted to alcohol or drugs or whatever it is. And again, it's very, very tough. In fact, Amanda, what percentage of true alcoholics actually overcome that addiction for life?
So I'm not sure about the statistics surrounding that, but I do know that for a lot of people in recovery, it takes multiple times before they're completely sober. And so you should expect them to relapse multiple times and need your help in getting back on track, which really means that these provisions, once somebody enters sobriety for the first time, these provisions are still essential and shouldn't be taken out.
And keep in mind that in many professions, if you're an alcoholic or a drug addict, it may mean liability in your profession. For example, let's say we have a lawyer who's an alcoholic and he's supposed to deliver papers on time, or she's supposed to do a will in a certain way, but the alcohol addiction is interfering from doing her best job. That's going to probably make her liable. Same thing with drug addiction. And again, so many people, I think, I once read it was 1 in 5 Americans who's an alcoholic. Now, it all depends how you define it. I mean, if, your dad comes home and he insists upon having 2, martinis before dinner, but that's it, that's what he does, is he an alcoholic? Well, I think different professionals would come to different conclusions. I had a friend up in Alaska who just wouldn't drink during the day, but he would drink as soon as he got off, and he kept going out of his office earlier. And he was a great friend of mine. And the last time I saw him, which was about 6 months before he died, he said, I would rather die than give up drinking. And he did. And Amanda, I don't know how you feel about this, but I've been told that to really break an addiction, that person has to become obsessive about something else in his or her lifetime. And that's one of the reasons I'm told that Alcoholics Anonymous is sometimes effective, although I think very, very few go to a few meetings and come out and change, but they become really addicted to Alcoholics Anonymous and helping others. That overcomes the alcohol addiction because they have a less harmful addiction, let's call it. But it's a very big problem. Now, there are some people that Molotov's daughter, you may remember Molotov left Russia, went to Mexico, and then Stalin had him killed. Well, he has a granddaughter who's one of the leading addiction physicians in the world, and she is located the spot in your brain where there's an addiction. I know, for example, I was addicted on cigarettes. I only smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day because I carefully timed between when I put my cigarette out and waited 20 minutes for another, but I was smoking 2 packs a day. Finally, when I had children and I was 30 years old, I quit. And I quit for 8 years. And then I went to an afternoon party and I did 2 things I never do. One, I had a drink before 5 o'clock, which I never do. And then number 2, a pretty young woman like Amanda came up and said, "Want to smoke?" And I said, yes. I was back addicted within 2 weeks. It's in your brain. And no matter how long you wait, it's not going to be overcome. When I went to my first communion in my church here in Garden City, I remember the minister saying, "By the way, you'll notice that we don't serve wine in these little glasses, but we serve grape juice. The reason is we have a number of alcoholics in our parish, and if we gave them just a drop of alcohol, they would be back, back basically on the road to alcoholism again." It's a lifelong problem. Maybe they'll be able to overcome it, something, in your brain. But right now, if you're addicted, and you have to accept it. And I've had so many friends and family members who say, "Oh, I'm not an alcoholic. I drink only because I like to drink. I don't have to drink. I just like to drink." Okay, can you give it up today? Well, why should I? Because I like it. The same thing when I had cigarettes. People would say, "Well, why don't you give it up for a couple of days?" And I'd say, "Well, why should I? I enjoy it." But I was completely addicted and denied it.
So, Amanda, wealth and addiction is something that we've talked about at a couple of points, but certainly we should expand on it. You want to comment on slide 9?
Yes. So consequences, those are the things that change our behavior. So for instance, I like to speed. And if there were no tickets on the horizon, I would keep speeding, and most people would. We don't necessarily do things because 1, it's the right thing, or 2, it's better. We do things because of consequences. And so with a lot of people who have a lot of wealth, they're able to avoid consequences. For instance, if they are driving and drinking and they hit somebody, they may be able to pay that person off versus having that person call 911, paying their insurance, get the DUI, all of that kind of stuff. And so the more consequences someone's able to evade, the worse the consequences become until eventually they're unable to evade them. So things like death, dying in a car accident or an overdose, or drinking yourself to death, medical issues, and there's only so much that money could end up buying. With people that are CEOs, they will have employees or business partners or other people who begin to enable them to cover things up, or who benefit from that individual continuing to drink. We worked with a CEO, and every time he drank, he would write checks to employees. And so as we were working with him, employees would come and say that they had to have confidential meetings with him, and then they would get him drinking again. And so navigating the whole business system along with the family system and the advisors that were working with that person and the legal system at that point made it a lot harder for this individual to move forward in their recovery if versus somebody who didn't have those levels of wealth and complications.
One of the fellows that I served with in the Army told me that alcoholism caused more human misery than all the wars combined. And I'm not sure that he was wrong. Again, whether it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 8 or 1 in 10, think about that's about 1 billion people in this world who are addicted to something, and it's harmful for them. I mean, wars are obviously terrible, and we don't want them anymore. And people who start wars, I think, are criminals, and maybe that's what international law now says. But alcoholism and drug addiction and other addictions are also extremely problematic. And we've got to make sure that we address it with the client. It's a very difficult and for almost everyone, an embarrassing thing. I dated my wife for 5 years before we got married. We often spent time at my parents' home. My wife never knew that my father was, a really, really bad alcoholic. Why? Because he had emphysema. And whenever he would go on a bender and be up in his room, we would just tell Betsy that, oh, he's going through, something doing with his emphysema. I was so embarrassed about it that I waited about 15 years after we were married, Amanda, before I even told my wife. I was so embarrassed. It was so depressing. It interfered so much with my life. It caused my grades to crash. It caused everything in my life to go bad. And I wish my mother had done something to take us to something like Al-Anon, which is, a program for family members, especially teens who have alcoholic parents. But my mother just didn't do it because she felt the family couldn't afford it. So it's a horrible problem, and we ought to do our job and at least identifying it and see what can be done to assist in overcoming it, although I will tell you it is extremely challenging. And again, I think if you really went to Alcoholics Anonymous, you would find that fewer than 10% of the people who attend their first meeting ever overcome their alcohol addiction.
By the way,
you
very quickly, the comment that Jonathan made is very important. Clients will often, especially I think wealthy clients, because of the shame of it, go to great lengths to hide these issues. And that's why it's so important for the entire advisory team, all of us, to bring these questions up, because otherwise we can't address it. And given the statistics that we've talked about throughout this program, and keep in mind, the stats that Amanda and Jonathan have mentioned several times are only about alcohol and drug abuse, not addiction generally. So if it's, for example, 1 in 8, 1 in 10 that have an alcohol or drug abuse problem, if you add in all the different types of addictive behaviors that could have adverse consequences, it is a much greater number. We need to normalize this, using the word that Amanda very appropriately used earlier, by asking everybody, including it in our questionnaires, having every advisor, you're doing a financial plan, ask the questions. You're doing a estate plan, ask the questions. We need to normalize it. We need to bring it up. We need to try to make these clients understand that it's not we're asking because we're nosy or trying to embarrass them. We're asking because we can actually help. We can help by doing encouraging them to contact the right people. We can help by creating trust with appropriate provisions. There's a lot we can do to help them. Amanda, I'm sorry to have cut you off.
Hey, I was just going to say to Jonathan that the shame of what you're talking about, it's not just for one person. The whole family has experienced it. The whole family is impacted. The whole family is sick, and everybody needs help. And because there's no discretion in going to rehab or getting help, people just don't go, and they just try to cover it up and make it okay. And that's exactly why we go into people's homes instead of asking them to go out. And none of our coaches are on the website. None of our people are on the website, so that they can have the confidentiality and the discretion to get the help that they need. And what we say is that, family relationships, family systems are like the baby mobile. You hit one piece and the whole thing spins. And so that's why we work with the whole family, and that's where the whole family needs support and assistance to be able to move forward. Because if you take one person out of the system and you send them to somewhere like rehab, or you send them away, then it's like taking a baby duck out of an oil spill, cleaning it off, putting it back in the oil spill, and then blaming the baby duck for getting dirty again. But you need to be able to go into the oil spill, clean the whole oil spill up and all the ducks in the process, so that everybody could be in a better place.
So Amanda, what are some of the signs of addiction, and perhaps also stress how we as advisors, without the medical knowledge that you have, can try to identify some of these issues or factors when we're speaking with clients, especially new clients?
Okay, so I want to just preface this by saying when I first got trained in CPR, I was on the lookout for any symptom of a heart attack. And so you can become hypervigilant once you notice any of these symptoms, you learn and identify them. You can become hypervigilant and think there's a heart attack where none exists, where someone's just having heartburn, for instance. So not every single sign of addiction means that there's addiction, but what you need to look for is patterns. What you need to look for is multiple signs, and be willing to ask the question. So you might notice changes in self-care. So somebody may, go from immaculately dressed to having shirts that have stains in them, or suddenly they smell, and it doesn't seem like they're caring for themselves in the way that they used to. They might lack purpose or identity. This is a really common thing when CEOs or executives who have built their career their whole life end up retiring. They lose their purpose and their identity because they've built nothing outside of that. That's a common time that people might fall into addiction. You might notice increased depression, fluctuating moods, lack of patience, irritability, and agitation around not getting money quick enough. If you're getting a call at 3 a.m. for somebody saying, I need $10,000, I'm going to start a business, that's probably not very accurate. And people will tell you sometimes flimsy stories, sometimes well put together stories about why they need money now. So again, you might get calls at odd hours. The reasons for needing money don't seem to align with the facts. There's a lack of accountability for their spending habits, so they can't really provide receipts for large purchases. You notice massive amounts of money disappearing. They can't really account for.
Amanda, let me just interject and give an example that I recently saw. So somebody was put on a budget, and they were given, what everybody involved thought were reasonable amounts for, leisure, restaurants, going out to dinner, because, it was a reasonably wealthy family. They weren't trying to harm or overly restrict the person. And what became very quickly apparent when the individual would go out for dinner and would send in receipts, you would see receipts for 5 meals instead of 1 meal. You would receive receipts from the same restaurant at the same time. What this individual was doing was taking out multiple friends, having them pay him cash, and he submitted the bill, which he put on the credit card he had, and was trying to get that through in order to get more money so that he used the cash to buy drugs, but submit to the family advisor who was helping distribute money and replenish the pool and pay the bills, multiple things. So those are the kind of lengths that people will go to. And it became very obvious that he was picking up receipts that other people left on their tables or on the floor, because you'd see 3 meals at the same restaurant within a half an hour of each other. So just an illustration of what Amanda's saying.
Absolutely. Desperate people do desperate things. And so you should expect that. You shouldn't penalize that. You should compassionately bring it to their attention that you've noticed it and confront them with the facts in a loving way. But, you are going to need to be able to look for these things and put the story together like Marty was talking about, so that you can actually be able to come to them with the facts and information and ask if they need help. You might notice trends of impulsive spending or irregular spending or significant changes in their spending habits, or increased medical and legal expenses. People end up going to jail if they get DUIs or, drug-related charges. They, have medical expenses, things like from overdoses or, any kind of number of things that could happen, hepatitis, liver damage, or even infections from injecting. So these are things you should look out for that may not be within their usual spending habits.
And they will do almost anything they can to hide it. I have a cousin who I long suspected was an alcoholic. Finally, his sister called me and said she caught him at 9 in the morning going out to their refrigerator in the garage where they kept orange juice and found him pouring vodka in the partially drunk orange juice container. But he says he doesn't have a problem. He drinks only because he likes to drink. Well, when you're hiding it, it means you do have a problem. But I will also tell you something else, Amanda, I believe. The only way that person is going to change their behavior is because they want to. You can't say, do it for your wife, for your husband, or your kids, or your cat, or your grandkids, or your firm. They have to do it for themselves. They have to accept that they have a problem, and they have to want to overcome that problem. And, you know, it's a very, very serious matter, but at least we can identify it and minimize the adverse effects of what we're doing. And again, I cannot imagine anyone doing a document today that involves the transmission of wealth where you don't have it in trust and don't have those provisions for addiction. I don't care who you are. I don't care if everybody is perfect right now. It will change over time. I mean, I've known a number of people who never drank before they were 40 and became raging alcoholics. Or they, you know, were just going to do a little bit of heroin. You know, they did it only because they liked it, and they became full-fledged drug addicts. And again, it can be so many other things. You know, it can be gambling. It can be very tough. And Amanda, would you address for the moment, what if you're in a situation where, say, a husband and wife both are alcoholics or drug addicts? Is there any way to break out of that? I mean, I just can't imagine trying to give up. Like, my wife gave up smoking immediately when she woke up one morning and said, I think the smoking is making me feel bad. I crawled the walls to quit, but I could not have done it if she was still smoking.
Yep, absolutely. So I will tell you that you can intervene with couples that are enabling each other and alcoholics together. If one confronts the other, if that person has a problem, then what they're having to say is, I have a problem too. And that's a really scary thing to say and suggest if you're not ready to get help. But I'm going to add a precursor to your comment about people need to get help for themselves. What I'll say is any reason to start sobriety is a good reason. If it's for their cat, if it's for their dog, if it's for their mom, any reason to launch that process in is a good enough reason. But Jonathan is right. In order to maintain sobriety, eventually it has to turn into my life is better because I'm sober.
Let me add a couple of comments. When you look on the right side, for example, well, actually the entirety of slide 21, to me, this slide is an important reinforcer of why a collaborative team effort to help clients is vital. I could be the estate planner. I could try to be as attuned to what the client's saying, read between the lines, ask the right questions, and may have no clue what's going on. But yet the financial advisor that's preparing a budget with the client, the financial advisor that's doing forecasting for the client, the accountant that may be reviewing financial statements to prepare a tax return, those advisors may have insight into the spending that I don't see. So really, by all of the advisors communicating, a trust officer that's tracking trust expenditures, collectively, we may be able to identify with some specificity that things that none of us can do individually or independently. So to really help clients that have all sorts of challenges, and I mean, I think it's imperative for planning generally, but especially with addiction type issues, a collaborative team effort is really incredibly important, and I strongly encourage that. So let's go on to the next slide. So what is the practitioner's role? Let's talk about some actionable takeaways. We've had a sort of a broad discussion of this, but what can you do? I'll make some comments, but I'm asking Jonathan and Amanda to either interrupt if they wish, or when I'm done to please jump in. So we need to identify the problems. We have to ask questions. As I've said earlier, included in the organizer to normalize it, included in the organizer so the client knows from inception that these things are important. A lot of clients don't realize it. Clients may come in looking for a will, unquote, quote unquote, and not realize that all these personal issues need to be addressed. include provisions in the default trust documents you draft, because it's another opportunity to have those discussions. The reality is that clients may be trying not to acknowledge the problems. That's not uncommon. We've talked about the shame, especially amongst supposedly wealthy, successful people that feel these aren't problems they should be having, but they are. The reality is they are. Open discussions. Don't have a fixed agenda. Listen between the lines of what the client's saying. Suggest an outside trustee who's familiar with addictive behaviors. My default is to always encourage an institutional trustee, because they have people that have seen these things, these issues, these problems, and will have more familiarity with it. Now, there's some issues that you'll face with institutional trustees, because there's certain roles or decisions that they may not be comfortable assuming, but that doesn't mean they don't have the expertise to help identify issues that maybe we as attorneys or accountants or financial advisors may not see. I won't even recount the myriad of different times where a senior, well-knowledgeable, well-experienced trust officer has identified these types of issues where they were hidden from me and I just didn't see them, and they spotted them fairly quickly. Also keep in mind, and this is why I always advocate for a team approach, clients on all sorts of issues, but especially difficult personal issues, will tell different advisors different things. So when the team collectively speaks, some of those inconsistencies or some of those little tips or tidbits, when we speak collectively as a team, we can piece together stuff that any of us could have done individually. Keep in mind that some friends and family members will not have the ability to deal with addiction issues. I was asked to be a trustee early in my career for a family member that had these types of issues, and I was young and naive, and I thought I was doing a good deed, and I accepted the position. And I was getting vile phone calls at 2 in the morning. I don't know if it was 3 in the morning that Amanda said, but I was getting all sorts of vile phone calls with death threats from this individual. I turned it over to an institution. They don't answer the phone after whatever 5 o'clock or on weekends. And obviously those calls stopped, and it's now 15 years later and the trust is still functioning. But the strain on me, because I was a family member and they thought they could call me any time of day or night and weekend, and they did, and say anything they wanted, made it very difficult. So on the other hand, a professional institutional trustee may have the expertise, but you got to find out what they're willing to do. And Jonathan made a comment earlier that is often the right answer or the only answer, and that is perhaps you have an institution involved, but also an individual trustee, and the individual trustee may be willing to take certain decisions that the institution can't because of policies and so on. The next point that I'm going to make, I'm going to ask Amanda when I'm done to comment, involve a mental health professional, social worker, care manager as appropriate. You definitely need to reach out. We have brought in care managers who've then reached out to other appropriate professionals because we may not have the network to do it. And Amanda, even though it may be a bit of a plug for yourself, I think you should explain to people some of the kinds of things where you can place social workers, for example, in the home for when somebody comes out of rehab. So hopefully help them get through that difficult post rehab period to help maybe enhance the chances of them succeeding. The dynamics in the family relationships are critical to address, and setting up boundaries, not just financial boundaries like we've talked about, but whether it be periodic drug testing. And Amanda, why don't you comment a little bit on some of these thoughts, and do take a minute and tell people what you can do, because I don't know that many of the people on the call are even familiar with the kind of services that any company like yours can provide.
Yeah, so for us, we are very, very, very passionate about helping families heal at home. And so this is not about one person who has a problem. This is about, like we talked about, the baby mobile, right? Everybody is impacted by each other, and you have well-meaning people in the family that end up being enablers. And so when that person returns from rehab, they end up in a position where they're back in the same habits. Everybody around them is acting the same, and everybody's, again, held hostage by the situation. So we have professionals that could actually live with clients and their families to help everybody change in the moment, instead of just reflecting back on it later in an office or relying on them to remember what to implement when they're in crisis. and relying on them to do it. So there's actually a guide who lives with them to walk them through these meaningful moments and create change where life actually happens. But you know, I've had trust advisors, I've had estate attorneys, I've had financial advisors call me and say, I suspect there's a problem. I don't know what to do. I know this isn't my lane, but I want to connect you with the family so that you can understand or you can gain insight into whether this is actually a problem or this is just, you know, a wrinkle. And so by connecting me with the family, and I'm able to assess, and then I could guide the trusted advisors in the next steps and work with the family to either get the help they need or help them understand, okay, maybe you're not an alcoholic, but your drinking is causing some problems. And like Jonathan was talking about, if you can't stop or if you're hiding it, that's typically a sign that you also know it's a problem, because we don't typically hide the things that we don't believe are problematic.
Jonathan, any comments before we go on?
No, I completely agree with Amanda, completely.
So Amanda, why don't you chat about slide 23, and Jonathan, please jump in if you have comments.
Okay, so I am a very proactive person, and I always encourage other people to be the same, because if you deal with it all up front, then it makes you able to just slide down the back end. You know, when either preventing a crisis or when a crisis actually occurs. So with that, you normalize things and you create a process that helps you identify when these issues are present. This could be discovery questions. This could be asking periodically when you meet them, and making sure it's a normalized process that you do across the board for everyone. You can create policies and procedures of how to handle these cases. Even if you're a solo practitioner, you could say, oh, the company policy is XYZ, so that you have something to fall back on. But as soon as somebody thinks that you have the power to make and change decisions, they will badger you and badger you and badger you, or negotiate until they get the thing that they want. And also, you know, just like we talked about with 911, have resources available and have relationships built so that you can be able to help clients access the care they need. What you don't want to do is be in that 911 situation and not know 911 exists. So be able to understand the resources available to you, and you can even reach out to me. I have a lot of resources, even outside of myself, and you know, just make sure that those are available and they're on a sheet that you can even give clients and say, here are some relationships I have if you would like to call. And you can even give those out at every single initial meeting with clients, because it's a normalized part of your process.
So for example, when I have clients that have addiction or mental health issues, Amanda is somebody that I call. When I have clients that have physical or aging issues, I have a number of care managers that I call and introduce the clients to. And I think that's very helpful. Let me raise a question. Go on.
Marty, let me just add one thing. Regardless of how you put your legal documents together, specifically authorize the use of the resources for these kind of problems. Don't feel, well, gee, it says I can pay or apply. I mean, be specific in saying that funds can be expended to provide treatment for an addiction or for, you know, some critical problem. It may not be cost effective overall for the family, but the most important thing is to make sure that the individuals whom you serve get the best possible treatment and the greatest care possible that they'll get, that's available to them. You ought to specifically put it in your documents. It's like people who don't address the fact that someone in the family maybe, you know, have some sort of retardation or something. I mean, every family has a problem. Every family can potentially suffer from some sort of brain condition, which will impair them forever. Specifically put these things in so that when you deal with the fiduciary will see that it has the authority to use those resources in the best way possible for the beneficiary or members of his or her family. For example, maybe you want to put in something that if, you know, an in-law has a problem, the trustee can, conferring with the beneficiary, use the resources to benefit or help that in-law.
Jonathan, let me ask you a question. I think some practitioners will be very uncomfortable dealing with these sensitive personal issues, and may just feel that, you know what, the client came and asked for a will, the client came and asked for a trust, that's what I'm going to do. And I'll give you an example. I have a new client meeting tomorrow. Client is very happy with their current advisor, but has some personal issues in the family and just wanted to get my insight on how to deal with this personal issue. And it strikes me that had their other advisor dealt with this issue, they wouldn't be calling for help, but they are. What do you do to help? What advice, you've done this for more than a couple of years. What advice or suggestions or thoughts can you share with the people on the webinar that are uncomfortable? I don't have any background in this. I've never really dealt with it. I don't have any knowledge. I haven't been trained to do it. This is not what I do. I'm a lawyer, or I'm a financial advisor. I'm not a social worker. What kind of suggestions, comments, or thoughts could you share to help people get comfortable or deal with something that they may not have dealt with much?
Well, Marty, very often, when I first got out of law school, the standard plan in the United States, even for wealthy people, is that you had the inherited assets go in trust, but pay out at 25, 30, and 35. If they were really conservative, it was 30, 40, and 50. And I thought that was the most ridiculous thing in the world. And I would say to people, are you absolutely confident that no one in your family will suffer a stroke and be able to not manage his or her money? Do you ever think you might have someone in the family who might have a retardation or a Down syndrome, which is an extra kind of gene that happens which causes, it to be downstroke? Hubert Humphrey, I mean, a really great man for the United States, had a retarded grandchild when he was the vice president of the United States. This can happen in any family. And that's why even if the guy comes in and says, well, my daughter is a managing director at Goldman Sachs, she's the smartest thing in the world, she could have a stroke. She could come down with dementia. She could be in an accident. And this can happen in every family. The way to do it is to start, and I think we've talked about this, don't make it specific for that particular client, but talk about how we have to cover the possibility of having some sort of addiction problem or other mental problem for the family, either for children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews, or for the client himself or herself, who thinks that she's never going to get, dementia, for example, or have a debilitating stroke or some other condition. You just can't say it's never going to happen to me or my loved ones. It can happen with anyone. And addiction can happen to anyone. The statistics are horrible. It's at least 1 in 10. And I personally believe, because of my life experience, that it's higher than that. And that means that you've got to talk to the client about it and have the client sign on that, yes, this needs to be addressed. Once you get them to address that issue, at least in the context of estate planning, maybe something else will come out where they say, well, I do have this kind of problem with booze or a problem with alcohol. I have this problem with tobacco. And by the way, eventually it would have killed me. I'd be dead right now if I hadn't quit smoking. But again, I had to admit to myself that it was a problem. It was doing me terrible harm. So you can start off with not, putting it right in the face of the client, but talking about more general. It can happen in any family. And we want to make sure that when it happens in your family, we've got the best resources available to address it in an appropriate way.
I think that one of the ways to open this up is broad, general questions and listen carefully to things the client says. Are there any challenges or issues that affect you or anyone in the family that we might want to consider in the planning? And listen to what the response is. Sometimes the way that the question is evaded or dismissed may tell you something. I think some practitioners, because I, like you, we weren't trained to deal with these issues, perhaps. But if you feel uncomfortable, oh gee, what if I offend the client if I ask too pointed of a question? If your role, whatever discipline you're in, your role is to help guide the client and the client's family. Your role is to advise the client and protect them and their loved ones. If you're asking a question sincerely to do your job of helping them, and your only motive is to help them, if the client is somehow upset or offended that you've asked a question to do your job well, that's, and I don't mean this in a harsh way, but that's the client's issue, not your issue. You're not doing anything wrong by asking tough questions. You're really doing your job. So don't be hesitant to ask tough questions. That's what we have to do. Discovery questions. Amanda, you want to talk about some of these?
Yes. So just a quick comment on what you said. Your job as trusted advisors is preparing for things that are statistically likely. So that could be issues of aging, that could be medical problems, hospitalizations, incapacitation in some way. And what I will say is that 1 in 4, some people say 1 in 5 people struggle with a mental health issue. So this is statistically likely and something that you need to prepare for in order to do your job completely, like Marty talked about. So going back to discovery questions, having these as a part of your process and being broad. Are there any health, lifestyle, or other circumstances affecting you or any of those you contemplate naming as beneficiaries or fiduciaries under your plan? Very broad and allows the client to answer in a variety of different ways. You can also ask pointed questions. Might any fiduciaries or beneficiaries have addiction issues, alcohol, drug, gambling, sex, shopping, or other that should be addressed in your plan? If you ask them about medical issues and you ask them about mental health issues in the same meeting, it normalizes it, because nobody is going to be offended if you ask them if they have medical issues and they have something like diabetes or they have something like a heart condition. They're going to be grateful that you asked, because you need to be able to plan for those kinds of things. So putting those together, if you have any physical or mental health issues that we need to plan for, it's all in the delivery of how you do it.
Jonathan, let me ask you a question to maybe amplify a point that Amanda just made, one of the many points she just made. I know when we have programs on GST planning at conferences, they're incredibly well attended. Everybody wants to learn about GST tax, but what percentage of the population would you wildly guess actually ever pays a GST tax or is really significantly affected by GST tax?
Well, Marty, it's way under 1%. But as Amanda pointed out, it's probably at least 20% of Americans are affected by some sort of mental problem. And that includes drug abuse. It includes alcoholism. It includes, how many people have schizophrenia. I've had partners and colleagues who have been schizophrenic where they were brilliant, brilliant lawyers, but, they just couldn't do it. Two of the really big mistakes that are made in law school are: one, we are taught nothing about law as a business, and that's such a shame. They go in and they drill into your head how to think like a lawyer, how to manipulate the law, so to speak, or figure out what the law is really selling to try to get the best result for your client. But these other things are really much more important, but the law schools just don't address the operation of law as a business, and it doesn't bring in these collateral issues. I mean, I'm going to tell you, the longer I live, the more I realize that a successful lawyer is not the one who knows the most about, the GST rules or, the rules relating to antitrust or, even elder law issues themselves as a legal matter. But you're being able to relate to the client and find out what the goals for the client really are and best figure out how to adopt them. And those are failures at all law schools even today. The law schools also fail because they don't bring enough about technology. And I'm just very, very surprised that the law schools haven't really addressed that and acknowledged that that needs to be done.
So the point is that we as practitioners in all different disciplines put a huge amount of time, energy, and thought into some very highly technical areas, and not enough thought and time into some of these softer areas. And I think it may be just part of the training. As Jonathan pointed out, it may be just our comfort zone, but we need to properly serve clients to get out of our comfort zone if we're uncomfortable and address these softer but vital issues that affect so many. What are some of the strengths or weaknesses when it comes to dealing with money? These are questions that may elicit some information to help identify problems. Tell me about your living situation. I like that because that's broad and so general. It could bring up all sorts of different things, not just addiction, but lifestyle, all sorts of things that could affect the planning. Do you have a past or present medical or mental health issue? You know, a lot of advisors are uncomfortable asking about that, but we shouldn't be. We as a country are horrible at dealing with mental health issues. Our sort of cultural view, my perception anyhow, is that when we're dealing with medical issues generally, you have a condition, you go to a physician, they do a procedure or give you a magic pill, you go home and you get better. Mental health is not that simple. And I think we do a tremendous disservice to all of us and all of our loved ones that have these challenges by not being more open and realistic about it. Tell me about your relationship with other family members. Great broad question where something may come up. What are some of the current stresses in your life? What are some of the major obstacles? Who do you turn to for support? So again, these are things that I think could be very helpful. And here are some more questions. Amanda, you want to go through these, and then we're going to wrap up in a minute or two because we're pretty much done.
Sure. I also want to comment on Jonathan's previous statement, and I think I'm not a lawyer, obviously, I'm a counselor, but when I think about lawyers, I think of the job of a lawyer being an advocate and facilitator of justice. And so what that means is that your job is to get to the truth so that you can properly advocate and facilitate justice. And when you don't ask questions, when you shy away from asking questions, even in an estate planning context, you are facilitating injustice because people end up harmed in the process when you're unwilling to ask the questions so that you can appropriately plan for what comes next. So when you're meeting with clients, you should also check in with yourself and ask yourself some questions like, do I feel like I have a solid baseline on this person? Or can I recognize changes that may occur in the future? Does this person have a solid support system? Are there discrepancies in their story? Are they changing it at particular points? Does it make sense to me? Are there any issues mentioned which require more investigation, planning, and or a need for input from other parties? Is there an involvement of a care manager or other mental health professional, or do we need to involve one to protect the client and the assets? Is there an involvement of a trustee, or do we need to involve one to protect the client and assets?
So here are some of the resources that may be helpful, and thank you to Amanda for giving them, and you all have these in your materials. We all need to be part of the solution. We need to partner with clients to help address these issues. We're gonna wrap up because we're at the end of our time. I just want to point out and thank Interactive Legal. On slide 32, 33, and 34 is their sample language for dealing with addiction and alcohol abuse. Amanda's contact data is there, and I want to thank Amanda for her great insights. I want to thank Jonathan for not only sharing his great insights, but for sharing some very difficult personal stories to really drive home how common and important all of this is. And thank you to all of you for joining us. I hope that this topic was relevant and helpful to you in your practices, and I hope it gives you some more comfort and more knowledge to help clients deal with these vital and difficult issues. Thank you again for joining us. Again, the handout materials are on the taskbar. You can still download them. The materials and the recording of this program will be posted within a few days to shankmanlaw.com. Thank you for joining us.